Well, there's a new report in Monday's New York Times that finds that the U.S. has been secretly giving cash to Afghan President Hamid Karzai for the past decade. The Afghan president responded saying he had, in fact, been receiving millions of dollars from the CIA. For more on that, we are now joined by Phyllis Bennis. She's director, New Internationalism Project, Institute for Public Policy, or Policy Studies, rather, excuse me. What was the most striking thing about this article that kind of jumped off the page for you?
The extraordinary detail in how it happens, that it's brought in sometimes in plastic bags. And, you know, it was just people who had done really good shoe leather reporting and had gotten the details. It wasn't news that this has been going on. This has been going on since the U.S. first invaded Afghanistan in over a decade ago. And it goes back, in fact, to the old warlords that the U.S. and particularly the CIA were bucking up against the Soviets back in several decades ago. One of the things that was so interesting, at the very end of the article, there's a reference from one of the people who was getting money here, and he said, you know, I'm on the enemies list of the FBI, but the CIA loves me. And it really speaks to that divergence of interests among the various forces of the U.S. government.
One of the things that jumped off the page for me, I think it was the third or fourth graph, and I'm going to paraphrase, I may not get it right, but it was a source who said, you want to find corruption in Afghanistan, it traces all the way back to Washington.
Absolutely.
It is a terrible indictment on the United States and their involvement, wouldn't you say?
It is, and for those of us who have said that this war was wrong right from the beginning and never wavered, it's one more piece of evidence of why it was wrong. This was always going to fuel corruption. It was never going to deal with corruption. We were never going to have a clean, democratic state when you have an imposed government put in power by an outside force and then kept in power by a foreign army occupying the country, and now we know tens of millions of dollars for him to pass out as he will, whether it was to his brother, whether it was to others. They were very careful to say there was no evidence that Karzai himself had profited from it. In a sense, he didn't need to, because all the people around him had done right well.
One of the things that you mentioned is this is nothing new. I remember it was about 3 years ago. I was in Stockholm, and this guy had just returned and was giving a speech there, and this was what he was saying, that it was Karzai, his brother. All of these officials were corrupt. But the point that he was making is that the regular rank-and-file people in Afghanistan were aware of it and were very unhappy about it. So what does this do in terms of the standing for the United States in foreign policy with that country?
Well, I think that it really destroys any hope anybody might have had, and I don't think there was much hope anyway, that once the troops are out, and we're not even hearing about that being on the agenda for 2014, we're only hearing about the possibility of withdrawing combat troops. But once all the troops are out, one could hope that there could be some kind of a reasonable way of rebuilding the U.S. reputation in Afghanistan. But in the wake of this sort of thing, where this fledgling economy that's struggling after so many decades of war, that left the country in absolute shambles, really, when they talk about bombing back to the Stone Age, this is very much what we see. The chances of rebuilding that relationship is almost non-existent.
I think it was the Beatles who said, money can't buy me love. And in this case, it hasn't as well, because Karzai has been critical of the United States in many respects, too.
Absolutely. This is the model we see in Iraq as well, where we back up a government, we put it in power, we pay for it, we arm it, we protect it, and then arguably in Iraq, you have a government that's more closely allied with Iran than it is with the U.S. Karzai is barely on speaking terms with anybody in Washington at this point, despite the fact that we're paying all this money. Iran used to pay some money to the Afghans. When they said we're going to sign this special relationship with the U.S., the Iranians said, we're out of here, and the CIA took over and said, well, good, we'll pay all you want.
Well, let me play devil's advocate and kind of piggyback off what you just said. What about the people who might say that, hey, this is the price of doing business in this country? I mean, like you said, Iran was paying money. If you want to have any kind of influence, it's just the way things are done.
Well, your crucial word is business. If you want to have business with this country, if you want to make money for U.S. contractors, for U.S. arms dealers, then you've got to have your people in place, and that means pouring money into it. If you want a government that Afghans build on their own, that they build without a U.S. occupation, it may not be the kind of government that people here in Washington want to see, but it will reflect Afghan sensibilities, Afghan goals, Afghan life. What we're leaving behind is a model of the kind of corruption that affects our own government. The difference is here, it's all about corporations that are the corrupt elements. There, it's individuals. That's really the only difference.
Phyllis, that's a whole nother conversation. Thank you so much for coming in and offering your insights.